Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
I'm Dean, I'm the dad.
I'm Laura, I'm the mom.
And I'm Arthur, I'm the son.
And together we are...
Family Plot. Plot Podcast is the best history podcast that we can make.
Like intellectual pancakes for the soul.
I've been called the cool dad you want to take a road trip with and learn about history from.
One of our listeners said listening to me was like Mom reading you a bedtime story full of cool history, and I am here for it.
And one of our reviewers called me the snarky brother they wish they had.
So join us to learn some cool stuff,
to hear some fun banter and wild tangents.
And we are unabashedly LGBTQ friendly and trans positive and supportive.
And remember,
when you listen,
you're our family.
So join us and occasionally some very cool guests
for the Family Plot Podcast.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey guys, I'm back. Sorry it's taking me so long to record again, but welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host, Cindy, and I'm just super busy at work. My boss went on maternity leave, and I have like 8 events this weekend or something fucking crazy. So it's just been very difficult finding time. I'm also my 10-year-old's chauffeur, so that's cool. But I'm back with an episode for December, and I'll definitely have at least one more this month for you guys, for your listening pleasure. And I wanted to say, if anybody wants to send me case suggestions, please do so. I've had a few come through, and unfortunately, most of them, there's not quite enough information for me to do a full episode. But I'm thinking even if I get enough, like, quarter cases, we'll call them, or like half cases, maybe what I'll do is just kind of string them all together and do like a true crime roundup episode, something like that, where I cover like 2 or 3 cases that are a little bit shorter in format, but that are important that people want to know about or should know about. So let me know if you have any cases from California. One of them that actually came up in the news, it's one that I covered the first time, like, I don't know, 5 years ago when I started the podcast with Diva when we were doing Twisted Listers. It worked out because we did like a shorter format podcast. Like each story was shorter. Anyway, the podcasts were long as hell, but the individual stories were a little bit shorter. And this one fit that. And this was the case of Obdulia Sanchez. Now, this is a woman who's from like Central California who at the time of this initial story was, I think, like, I don't know if she was like 17 or 18, but her younger sister was 14, and they were driving in a car on like a country road, which is what California is full of. And Obdulia was like wasted drunk, just like completely fucked up out of her mind. And she was live streaming. And during her drunken car driving live stream, she crashed, and she crashed super, super gnarly. And she was in the car with 2 other people, one of them being her 14-year-old sister, and her 14-year-old sister was thrown from the car, and her head was cracked open, and you could see like her brains, and it was insane. And this was all live streamed while Obdulia is like wasted, like not even, you know, realizing the gravity of the situation. Totally fucked up story. But it's interesting because she was back in the news this past week because she was actually killed in a drive-by in Stockton, which a lot of people in the comments are saying, well, that's karma for you. And I wouldn't go as far as saying that, but I would say that, like, you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes, or another, you know, popular saying is fuck around and find out. Her family had previously come out and said that she has like pretty severe mental issues, which is super sad if true. And, you know, either way, this is a young person who was killed violently in California, and it fucking sucks. But it was just really interesting to me that story had this conclusion. And I have to say, at the time when I was hearing about her, I had a feeling that once she got out of prison, she would sort of continue this lifestyle, and clearly she did. So that's a crazy case if you guys want to look that one up, but I wanted to call that out. That's one of the like smaller, shorter cases that could be covered in an episode like that. But all that being said, let's get into the case for this week. So it's actually funny. I had said at the last, when I was doing the last case, that I was going to cover more survivor stories. And I had mentioned Mary Vincent, and it kind of got her story stuck in my head. So I was like, fuck it. Let's just do back-to-back survivor stories. Let's just cover the case now. It's a really interesting case. I'll do a holiday case this month, of course. But I have always been really interested in Mary Vincent's case. Mostly because there is kind of a lot about her life after this traumatic experience. And I think it's really important to sort of focus on the victims' lives when they do survive. Because I think, again, I said this last time, a lot of people sort of romanticize like surviving an attack like this. And they don't really think about how insanely traumatic it is to have something like this happen to you. So I wanted to cover this story because Mary has been very vocal about the things that have been challenging for her in her life since being attacked. And I just think it's important to think about that. And this is also a crazy case. So let's get into it. Oh, one more thing, actually. So there's not a lot known about the man who attacked her. Basically, very little known about him before the attack. So I didn't do like a deep dive. Again, it was really difficult to find anything, but I definitely made a point of finding out a little bit more about him. Very little, but I tried to research anything about him prior to this attack, and I got a little information. So even if you know this story, you probably will hear a few things that you haven't heard before. So that's interesting and exciting, hopefully. All right. So Mary Vincent was born in 1963 in Nevada to a card dealer mother and a mechanic father who met while in the military in some capacity. I don't know if both of her parents were in the military. I believe her father definitely was. I'm not sure about her mother. It's very unclear, and I looked several places to try and figure it out. But in any case, one of them was in the military, if not both. Now, Mary was one of 7 children born to the couple and lived in a home full of rules, but also a bit of chaos, as any home with that many people in it will have, sort of no matter what. Her parents were strict in order to try to keep the household running properly. Plus, we have the military influence, but they did also allow Mary to be fairly creative, which was really important because Mary was, and will always be an artist and a very creative person. So, like I said, she was a great artist, but she was also a great dancer by the time she was a teenager. Like a trained dancer who took it very, very seriously and who had a teacher who really, really believed in her at that time. A little bit more about Mary. She's half Filipino. Not sure which parent, as I couldn't find any photos of her young life, but I think probably her mother. She also spent some of her young life living in the Philippines, which is pretty cool. I'm not sure if she speaks Tagalog, but maybe. She's very petite, coming in around 5'2" and weighing at most 100 pounds. Mary, like I said, she was an artist. She was also a bit of a free spirit and often would butt heads with her parents as a result. Now, from what I've read, she was pretty close with her grandfather. Not sure if it was her mother or father's parent, but I do know that whichever grandparent he was, he and Mary had a very good relationship. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog scratching himself in the background. Her grandfather lived in California, so not super far from Mary's family, so they were able to see each other fairly often, and they had like a really, really great bond. Now, when Mary was 15, her parents, who hadn't had a great relationship for quite a while, ended up in a pretty bitter divorce. Now, on top of everything else, the rules, the fighting with her parents, she just got really sick of the chaos and of also like dealing with her parents, having this crazy divorce where they're probably, sniping at each other, and just, it was not a good situation. So she's 15 years old and she decides to run away to California. At first, she spent time on the streets, sleeping in cars and sometimes outdoors, with no real stable living situation. This went on for a while before she became pretty homesick and missed her family, but not really her parents so much. She didn't feel super supported there. She wanted to go be with somebody who she felt loved her and who would take care of her, so she decided to hitchhike to her grandfather's house. This was in 1978, and as many of you know, hitchhiking back in those days was super common. People would meet up in groups to try to get rides. They'd have signs. It was a totally normal way to travel. And this is despite all the murders and rapes and just horrible things that happened as a result of hitchhiking. It was still considered safe, and people did it constantly, which is really weird, but I think it just took a little time for the stories to circulate and people to be like, holy shit, we probably shouldn't do this. But at this time, it was still something that people did pretty regularly, and Mary was no exception. At this point, she had found herself in the Bay Area, but her grandfather lived in the LA area, so she had quite a bit of distance to cover. The exact date was September 29th, 1978, so had she been home, she would have been in high school. But instead, 15-year-old Mary is out hitchhiking around California, surrounded by other hitchhikers out doing the exact same thing. Like many other days, on this day, Mary was waiting by the freeway along with a few other groups of young travelers. She was looking to go south, like I'd said, towards LA, where her grandfather lived. After a while, a man in a large van pulled up and offered only Mary a ride. He looked to be in his 50s and had a large van with no back seats, but nothing else inside the van, which made it super weird when he said he could only take Mary and nobody else. Mary had been sort of hanging out with one of these other groups. It was a couple of young guys. And when this all went down, they told her, like, I wouldn't go with him if I were you. Like, you should not take this ride. This was, as it turned out, very solid advice. But you know how it goes when you're young and invincible. Nothing bad could ever happen to you. It could happen to somebody else, but not you. And Mary was tired and just so ready to be with her grandfather and have this whole ordeal be over with. Being on the streets is hard. Mary was just, done with it. All she cared about was getting to her family, getting to a place to sleep and live and be taken care of. So she got into the van of the man she described as, quote, looking like a grandpa. This man, 51-year-old Lawrence Larry Singleton, was in fact not a grandpa, but was either a still married or very recently divorced merchant seaman. Now, a merchant seaman works on boats, usually delivering goods to and from someplace. So Larry was away quite a bit for work, but still managed to have a marriage happen and also fall apart just before this incident. Now, as I mentioned, I did some research on Lawrence Singleton, and I'm going to speak to that. So again, there's not a ton out there about him, but I can, kind of talk about what I did find. His life before this attack is not very well documented, but I did use Ancestry.com, and I found through there that he was one of 9 children born to a mother who was 19 years younger than her husband, his father. He was born and raised mostly in Florida before moving to California, probably for work. His siblings, from what I can tell, mostly married and mostly stayed in Florida, with only his eldest sister ever having any children, which I find interesting. Now, maybe Ancestry just doesn't have that information, but I did some other digging, kind of finding, I found the names of his family on Ancestry, and then I used Google, and I used like a Family Tree Now app, and I just really couldn't find any other children for any of his siblings. Also, just wanted to note he's like a middle child, which I don't know what that means, but just something to note. Anyway, I can only imagine what his childhood was like, having a father who was, nearly 20 years older than his mother, having that many kids. I mean, we have no proof that it was terrible, but if I had to guess, that's what I would probably say. So anyway, at some point, like I said, he moved to California, married briefly for only about a year, and that gets us, unfortunately, up to speed into 1978. I don't know that he had any sort of criminal record from before this attack. Probably little things, petty thefts, things of that nature, but nothing that really came up anywhere. So now it's 1978, and he's picking up Mary Vincent on the freeway and promising to take her to the LA area. As I had mentioned, Mary was very tired and just wanted to get where she was going. So pretty much as soon as she got into the van, she fell asleep, which sounds super crazy to me, like to be with this random dude and you're a young teenager and you just fall asleep. But again, hitchhiking was very common back then. Again, at 15, you think you're invincible. We all thought that. So I'm not judging her. It is just something I did want. You can't just say that and not talk about it. It's an interesting choice. But again, She's a kid, you know. Now, it's unclear how long she was asleep, but when she did wake up, she realized they were driving in the wrong direction. They were driving back towards the Bay Area instead of towards LA. When Mary realized this, she was bold enough to call it out to Larry, who surprisingly agreed to turn around and drive in the proper direction. He told Mary it was a simple mistake. He wasn't familiar with the area. It was like getting dark. And she believed him. You know, he was super quick to correct his mistake. So she didn't really worry about it too much. After a short while, he told Mary he had to get out to go pee and pulled over near Del Puerto Canyon, which is outside of Modesto. So very much in Central California, only about an hour or so south of where they started. So again, who knows where he drove while she was asleep. Now from here, I've read differing accounts of what happened next. Not so much the specifics of the attack as much as the reasoning on Mary's end for what she was doing. Apparently, when Mary fell asleep, she took off her shoes. So when they pulled off the road, she was barefoot or maybe only in socks. I don't really know for sure. Now, to clarify what I'm talking about is I've read and heard that Mary was relaxed after Larry turned the van around. But Mary actually did an episode of I Survived. And in that episode, she said that she was planning to run away from him when he pulled over because she was scared that he might hurt her. So maybe in her mind, she was like wanting to believe everything was going to be okay. And the fact that he turned the van around when she called it out could be a good sign, like, oh, an honest mistake. But she said in the back of her mind, like, she was scared. So sometimes what you'll read is that Mary was tying her shoes so that she could stretch her legs while Larry went out and did like a nature pee. But really, she was planning to run away, figuring she could outrun an older, out-of-shape man like Larry. Sometimes you'll read, she felt fine, everything was great, she just wanted to stretch her legs. That is not true. Out of Mary's mouth, she was scared, she wanted to escape. Unfortunately, while she was bent down inside the van tying her shoes, Larry either opened her passenger door or came in through the driver's side and hit Mary in the head with a sledgehammer. As you can imagine, this knocked her sideways, and by the time she sort of came to, Larry was on her. He tied her up and threw her in the back of the van, where he raped and sodomized her for over 6 hours into the early hours of the morning. This was obviously extremely horrific for Mary, scary and painful and just fucking awful. And the whole time, she kept asking him to set her free. Set me free, please, I won't tell anyone. She just kept saying this over and over. Now, for a while, Larry fell asleep and she was tied up and unable to move. And finally, the next morning, Larry takes her out of the van completely naked and bloody from the attack because it was not, it was violent. It was very, very violent. Again, you know, she is scared, she's tired, but she hasn't given up and she asks him to please set her free. And he says, "You want to be set free? I'll set you free." As he is saying this, "I'll set you free," he begins to sort of push Mary, and they're sort of like fighting. And I'm not really sure that she knew why at that point. But she grabs a hold of him and starts to struggle against him. Now, one thing is they were standing on the side of the road above like a 30-foot hill that rolled down into a culvert, and she didn't want to be thrown down there naked. So she grabbed onto his shirt as hard as she could, but it didn't do much as Larry had a hatchet in his hand and began hacking at Mary as they struggled. Now, what happened next is just beyond comprehension. It is so horrible. Mary said that she remembered having a hold of Larry and was holding him tight, but somehow, despite her grip, she began to fall backwards. And as she fell, she grabbed Larry with her other hand. But again, despite her grip, she began falling backwards. Then she felt pain in her arms, and as she fell, she saw both of her hands and parts of her arms still attached to Larry Singleton. They had been cut from her body just above her elbows. After she rolled down this 30-foot dirt hill into the culvert, she looked up and saw Larry shaking his arms as if there was a fly bothering him. She pretty quickly realized what he was actually doing was trying to shake off her severed arms from his, which he did successfully while Mary watched in horror from below. He then disappeared presumably into his van, leaving Mary to die in the culvert. But Mary did not die. Instead, Mary laid there for a moment, completely in shock, before nearly giving in to the overwhelming desire to just fall asleep. She said she felt so incredibly tired. And she almost gave in. But then a voice in her head told her to get up and climb up that hill, and that she had to survive to keep this man from ever doing this to anybody else. Mary was losing blood quickly, of course, but she remembered something she learned while living in the Philippines. If you ever have a wound that won't stop bleeding and you're not somewhere where you can get help, you can pack it with dirt or mud until you can get somewhere for somebody to help you. So Mary, thinking quickly despite her insane injuries and crazy blood loss, stuck both of her arms into the mud and packed the wounds to stop the bleeding, and it sort of worked. What's crazy is that she thought to do this at this age in this moment. I mean, this is so much for anybody to handle. So this is amazing. She then crawled her way up the 30-foot bank without hands and part of her arms and dragged her nude body up to the road to try to find some help. Now, the whole time she was walking nude, bloody, covered in dirt and mud, she was holding her arms above her head to keep the muscles and blood from falling out. And the entire time, Sorry, that was my dog. And the entire time, she was also terrified that Larry would come back and finish her off. Now, despite these insane injuries and despite her terror, she stood on the road and yelled for help. The first car to pass slowed down, got a good look at Mary, and sped away, which is such a shitty fucking thing to do. But, to be fair, that would be beyond traumatic to see, let alone to get involved. It's very Texas Chainsaw, the murderer might be right behind her, but honestly, I still think that that's fucked. Fuck those people, seriously. Now, the second car to see her, which contained a young couple, stopped, got her into the car, and drove her to the hospital. And man, is it a good thing they did. Because by the time she arrived, she had lost over half of the blood in her body, which is not really something you're supposed to be able to survive. And on top of that, she had an infection in the remaining blood, which made survival even less likely for Mary. Doctors immediately began working on her, but I will tell you, before she even got in that operating room, she was trying to talk to the cops, because that's why she survived. She wanted to let them know who did this to her. She wanted to stop him from doing it again. And as we know, she did in fact survive and recovered amazingly well considering what happened to her, at least physically. I've read a few places that while she was being wheeled in for surgery, she found an officer and tried to tell him about her attacker, which is what I'm saying, she did. So even before, she's barely alive, barely awake, and she's trying to give her account. This is what he looked like. Absolutely insane and amazing. And as a note, I'm talking about him using his name, but she didn't know who he was, obviously. And then once she came out of surgery, but while still healing, she worked with a police sketch artist to create a picture of Larry, which was then put out everywhere. Now, it wasn't immediate that he was caught, but everyone, all over the country saw it. This was a huge, huge fucking story. And eventually, one of his neighbors saw the sketch on the news and called police, saying they thought it might be their neighbor Larry who attacked the young Mary. They were right, and within about 3 weeks of the attack, Lawrence Singleton was arrested and charged for rape, kidnapping, mayhem, and attempted murder. At this point, Mary Vincent was already wearing prosthetic arms because she was not one to let things slow her down. And she was like, suit me up. I need my hands. Let's get this going. And when his trial came around about 6 months later, she testified against him, which she later said was terrifying. But she had to do it so he wouldn't be able to do what he did to her to anyone else ever again. Now, her testimony was a large part of why he was convicted on all counts. So it was very important that she did this, even though it was terrifying. When asked to identify Lawrence Singleton in court, she pointed at him with her silver prosthetic hook hand and said, "That's the man who attacked me. I was attacked," she said. "I was raped and my hands were cut off. He used a hatchet. He left me to die." She said that after the trial, she had to walk by him, right by him, which to me seems crazy. Get it together, courts. Why are you making victims walk by their attackers? But anyway, as she did walk by him, and as she did, he said to her, "If it's the last thing I do, I will finish the job," which is fucking terrifying. Like, this poor girl did nothing wrong, is attacked, raped, brutalized, has her arms removed, and then the man vows to finish the job if he ever gets out of prison. So from here, I do want to talk a little bit about Mary's life, like I said, because there's more to this story. And I think, it's important how we see how this type of life-altering attack is more than just a happy ending survivor story. But before I do that, going back real quick, Lawrence Singleton was sentenced. He was found guilty on all charges, like I said, but he was sentenced to a measly 14 years in prison, which is the maximum for all of the above charges allowed at the time in California, which honestly confuses the hell out of me, considering that the Chowchilla kidnappers got life for kidnapping. I mean, it's not fair to say it was like less of a crime, but like they didn't cut anybody's arms off or rape anybody, you know? So for those 3 men to get life and for this motherfucker to get 14 years, I would really like to further understand how the law works in that way, that's how that worked. And I'll tell you right now, he only served just over 8 of those years, which is absolutely fucking criminal. And this information really plays in to Mary's life and the way things go for her after this attack. So obviously we want to know what happens to him, but in the greater picture, in the broader picture, it's important to know because his freedom directly affects Mary's life. Okay, so now let's just talk about Mary. So after the attack, Mary's dancing career obviously, was over before it even started, and not because she didn't have hands. That wasn't the problem so much as she had to have a muscle, muscle taken out of her leg to be put into her arms so that they could still kind of function, which was really unfortunate because her dance instructor had set up a ton of like meetings and things for Mary's future. She's getting to the age where it's like, if you're going to become like a professional dancer, it's going to happen kind of now. At 15 is sort of when that gets set in motion. So it was really unfortunate because it really did sound like she had a future there, and this attack completely destroyed that. Beyond that blow, Mary was terrified all the time. Scared to be alone, scared to trust anyone. She had nightmares for years. In an interview nearly 20 years after the attack, Mary said that Larry effectively ended her life that day, even though she was still alive. And I don't think she meant like he killed her. He just ended her life as she knew it. Like, her life was never the same after that, which I think, that's fair. That feels very, very fair. And, it wasn't just physically that he changed her life. It was mentally and emotionally as well. Despite this, Mary's a fighter. She's a tough person, obviously. And she did the best that she could. And she actually became an artist. Her work is mainly in pastels and depicts powerfully upbeat women, which I think makes a lot of sense. She also did portraits on commission for a while. I don't know if she still does. But, she, despite what was going on inside of her, she did everything she could to maintain as much of a normal life as possible, at least, outwardly. To this end, she got married in her early 20s and had 2 sons with her husband, Tom. Unfortunately, by her mid-30s, Mary had divorced, and while there isn't a lot of information about her divorce, it sounds like her husband wasn't happy, like, with all the publicity that her story brought to their home, and they just weren't super compatible. So by the time she was 34, she had 2 sons aged 10 and 8, no steady job, and for a while, the 3 of them ended up living in an abandoned gas station with no electricity. During this time, Mary had disability payments. Obviously, that makes sense. And at this point, they had been stopped because the government realized that she'd received a settlement for her injuries, and they counted it as income. Because if you're poor, they want you to stay that way. So if you get a $13,000 settlement, which is what she had, you're not going to be able to get ahead with that money. You're just going to lose out on your disability payments to that amount because fuck you. That's how our world works. Don't get me started. Mary tried other things. She tried to write a book. She tried to sell the story for a movie, kind of anything to help with the bills and raising her kids. But unfortunately, everything fell through and she was left with very, very little. She had actually successfully sued Larry Singleton, but you can't bleed a turnip. So she never saw a dime of the $2.5 million settlement she won against him, which honestly, it's there's no way she would have ever seen that money. I think it was sort of just, I don't know. They just gave it to her as like a token of, yeah, we know your life sucks, I guess, And to be fair, at this time, Mary's life was very, very hard. She was definitely, selling her art, hustling, but things were very bleak, which is just another layer of sadness to this story. She was able to get back on her feet eventually, but it took a lot of fighting on her end, which just does not seem fair. And I mean, it just seems like one thing after another, She did get back on her feet eventually, and here and there, things would be good for Mary, but the fear was always nearby. And it came flooding back in 1987 when Larry Singleton was paroled, despite huge public outcry. At first, law enforcement had a hell of a time placing him anywhere, as no city would take him, and when they tried to send him to Florida to be near his family, they were rejected by the state. Weirdly, his ex-wife offered for him to live with her in Nevada, but that fell through as well. I find it really interesting, and she was basically like, he might have made a mistake, but he's not a bad person and he deserves a chance. And it's like, dude, what the fuck? Like, I don't know. I wouldn't let him live with me, I'll tell you that. So he finally ended up in a halfway house somewhere for a while, and then eventually he did move back to his home state of Florida. Now, I don't know exactly when, but it was probably at some point like when his parole was over, because I don't think he would have been allowed to before then. But after some time, he did move back to Florida. At the time, Mary was living up in Washington state with her sons, but she still lived in like complete terror that he would live up to his promise and finish the job, which totally fair. This man said, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to finish the job. And then he gets paroled. It's like, I mean, I can't imagine what she was going through. This is so fucked. Now, meanwhile, while Mary's living in terror up in Washington state, Larry was in and out of trouble down in Florida, mostly for petty crimes like theft. He had a troubled life in general, obviously, and in 1997, he ended up in a mental hospital after trying to end his own life. He had again been arrested for theft and decided he didn't want to live any longer, there was no reason for him to exist, blah, blah, blah. He left a suicide note for his family and attempted to kill himself by inhaling car exhaust by putting a tube from the exhaust pipe of his car, or of his van, into the window. His neighbor actually found him passed out inside the van and called 911. So he would have probably fucking died if his neighbor hadn't seen him, which is crazy. Larry was then taken to the hospital, and once he was treated and, feeling better, he was taken to a mental hospital for evaluation. Now, he was released February 10th, 1997, despite pleas from his family to keep him in the hospital as they believed that he was a danger to himself and others, which I would say, no fucking duh. Like, I'm not even his family member, and I could have told you that. And as if to prove just how right his family was, 9 days after being released from the hospital, Larry Singleton murdered another woman, or not another, I guess he didn't murder Mary, but he murdered a woman, 31-year-old Roxanne Hayes. Roxanne Hayes was a sex worker at the time, and Singleton picked her up and brought her back to his home in Tampa, Florida. Beyond her job, which back then was reported in a much less kind way, Roxanne was the mother of 2 small children and had a steady, long-term boyfriend. I actually think she had 3 kids. 3 fucking young kids and a long-term steady boyfriend. But nobody ever talked about that. I had to dig deep for that information. So Larry and Roxanne get to his house around 3:30 p.m. per his neighbor on February 19th. At the time, according to the neighbor, Larry seemed sober, as did Roxanne. Later that afternoon, so an hour or two later, around 5:30, 6:30, something like that, a man who was painting Larry's house for him came by to do some touch-up painting. He saw Larry's van parked around back and his back door open, so he went inside, calling out for Larry. He said he heard moaning and thought that Larry was maybe having sex, which is kind of weird, and also saw at least 5 pill bottles on the table in the kitchen. This is just what he remembers. He then walked further into the house towards the living room, but stopped in the doorway when he saw Larry naked bending over a woman who was sitting on his couch, also naked and with blood on her thigh. The man said that that Larry looked up towards him when he heard him come in, but that his stare was more like staring through him, as if he was like in some sort of state, or maybe so drunk that he was blacked out, which is terrifying. If you've ever seen that stare, it can be quite scary. This man ran outside to his uncle who had come with to help paint the house and told him what he had seen. This man then tried to go back inside the house with a shovel because he was going to fuck Larry up. Because he realized the woman was being attacked, but his uncle stopped him, which I want to say I understand, but that also fucking sucks considering what happens next. Instead of going back inside, the two men went to the front of the house and looked in through the living room window, where they saw the woman on the couch with Larry standing over her with his hand around her neck. They heard the woman say help in a muffled voice. Then they heard Larry say, "Shut up, bitch," before repeatedly hitting her in the face with his other fist. The men said each time he hit her, they heard bone-crushing sounds, which is fucking horrifying. The two men watched in horror as the attack went on for a few minutes before they finally left to go to a gas station to call for help. Because remember, there weren't really cell phones at this time, so if you wanted to call somebody, you're doing it from a landline. Now, when an officer arrived around 6:30, so I guess this was like 5:30 or so that this started. So at 6:30 when the officer arrived, he found Larry in an open shirt and shorts with a bloody cut on his chest. Larry was in his kitchen. And so the cop comes up and he asks him what happened. And Larry said he and his girlfriend got into a fight, but that everything was fine and the officer could leave. Instead, the cop followed him farther into his house. In the living room, he found Roxanne's body on the ground, not moving or breathing. She had a blood clot in her nose and cuts all over her body. Larry Singleton was arrested, and sadly, Roxanne was pronounced dead at the scene. Now, her cause of death was actually stabbing, believe it or not, which I don't even know when it happened, potentially after the two men left, because they didn't see it happening. They only saw the beating. But all of this is to say this was an extremely, extremely violent and prolonged attack, and something that nobody deserves, and just fuck this fucking monster. So once again here, Lawrence Singleton is arrested and finds himself on trial for a violent crime. And once again, Mary Vincent found herself on the stand reliving her attack for a jury in the hopes of finally putting this motherfucker away forever. And it worked. In April 1998, Lawrence Singleton was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to death, with Mary's story playing a large part in the sentence he was given. His past history of super violent crime drove home the fact that this man had no intention of ever changing and was a menace to women everywhere. Larry appealed this sentencing multiple times. He was rejected every time. But in the end, it didn't matter, as not very long after, 3 years in fact, Larry Singleton died in prison from cancer at the age of 74. Which means that when he murdered Roxanne Hayes, he was in his late 60s or maybe even 70 years old. Which is super crazy to me because it means you never really think of like the elderly as being killers, but they're out there and he was one of them. As for Mary, going back to Mary, because fuck this guy, I'm glad we're done talking about him. Mary remarried a man who worked for the district attorney down in Orange County, which makes sense, as that's probably the safest she ever felt, married to a man who works with law enforcement after her attacker was put away for life. And she lived with this man in Southern California for a while, but sadly, this marriage also ended. By this time, her boys were grown, so she moved back up to the Pacific Northwest, where she married for a third and seemingly final time. What's a cute story that I heard was when she met her future third husband, she told him, "You look like my third husband." When he then asked her how many times she'd been married, she said twice. So despite everything, she's still very clever and has a great sense of humor. And apparently, as of right now in 2025, Mary lives a very quiet life with her husband, mostly out of the spotlight. And I'm so happy to say that she finally found the peace and stability that she deserves, because it's about damn time. And I just want to say, how disappointing it is that people who have these horrific things happen to them are basically just left on their own by society, by our government. It's like it's almost like things are, everything's stacked against them. Like, you can't win for losing when you're in a situation like this. And I just want to drive home how absolutely unfair that is, and how amazing it is that somebody like Mary was able to keep going and, end up with sort of a happy ending, which she absolutely deserves. One, because she's a human being, and two, because she fucking went through it, man. Like, that's rough as hell. So that's the end of the story. I hope everybody enjoyed. I know I said I was going to do a Christmas story, and maybe I will. I don't know. There's like the Covina massacre. That one's horrible. And like, I don't know. There's not that much to it. It's just like kind of bleak. But I was actually talking to somebody today about skateboarding and like skateboarding in the past, and they brought up, well, they didn't bring up, they just like brought up skaters from like the 80s and 90s, and it got me to thinking about Mark Rogowski. He went by Gator, and he is a murderer, and his story is crazy. The actual murder itself is not a huge story, but sort of the rise and fall of Gator, the skateboarder, is really, really interesting. So I was thinking about covering that. I might leave that for January because I might want to do like a deeper dive. There's some really good like documentaries out there, but if I leave it to January, then I'll do a Christmassy story. I'll see what I can find. And if I don't, and I just do Gator next, then, we'll just do the holidays next year. So anyway, thanks everybody for listening. Please like, rate, review. Sorry it's taking me so long to get these out. My boss went on maternity leave, so I am now taking on extra work and doing extra things, and also just been busy. So that's life. I do this when I can. I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you so much for listening. I will have at least one more episode out this month. And tell everybody get more, help me spread the word about True Crime California. Thanks again, everybody. And until next time, stay safe.